Elias Vance didn't even wait for her to set down her bag. He looked at Clara Whitmore the way a man looks at something he ordered by mistake. A single sweeping glance, top to bottom, and then the kind of silence that says everything words are too polite to say. "You didn't mention this in your letters," he said. His voice was flat, almost bored. Clara stood on the porch of the Vance ranch with mud on her boots and 3 days of travel still sitting in her bones. She'd crossed half of Montana to get here. She'd packed her hope like it was the most fragile thing she owned. "Mention what?" she asked, though some part of her already knew. Elias tilted his head toward her, toward all of her, and let out a short breath. You. I have a reputation in this county, Miss Whitmore. I need a wife who can stand beside me in public without people talking." The two ranch hands near the fence weren't even pretending not to listen. "I think," Elias said, picking up her trunk himself and setting it back on the ground at the top of the porch steps, "you should find your way back to wherever you came from. If you were standing in Clara's shoes in that moment, if you'd sold everything, crossed the wilderness, written your heart into letters for 8 months, what would you have done? Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end, because this is one you won't want to walk away from. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Clara Whitmore left Harlan, Ohio, she woke up before the sun. Not because she was excited, though she was. Not because she was nervous, though her hands had been unsteady for days. She woke up early because she'd stopped sleeping the way regular people sleep somewhere around the age of 22, when her mother sat her down at the kitchen table and said, very quietly and very deliberately, "Clara, you need to start thinking realistically about what kind of life is actually available to a woman like you." A woman like you. She'd heard that phrase so many times by now that it had lost most of its sting. Most. Not all. It was the kind of phrase that found you in the dark, in the space between sleeping and waking, and reminded you that other people had already decided what you were worth before you'd had a chance to say a word about it yourself. Clara was 31 years old. She was wide through the hips and full through the face, and she carried her weight the way women do when they've spent a lifetime being apologetic about it, with her shoulders pulled in slightly, her movements careful, as though she was always trying to take up less room than she actually needed. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness, and a mind that had always worked faster than people around her expected, which only made the dismissals sting worse, because she always knew exactly what they were doing. She'd tried the ordinary routes. She'd tried the church socials and the county dances and the polite introductions arranged by well-meaning neighbors. She'd tried being quieter, and she'd tried being livelier, and she'd tried dressing differently and fixing her hair differently and laughing at the right moments, and none of it had ever made any difference, because the men who looked at her saw one thing first, and that thing had already made up their minds before she'd opened her mouth. The letters had been different. She'd answered the advertisement in the Ohio Register on a Tuesday evening in February, sitting at the small desk in a rented room above the milliner's shop where she worked. She'd read it 3 times. Rancher, widowed, 41 years of age, seeks companionable woman of good character for correspondence with intent toward marriage. Serious inquiries only. E. Vance, Hargrove County, Montana Territory. She almost didn't write. She talked herself out of it twice between Tuesday and Thursday, but on Friday morning she picked up her pen and she wrote 4 pages, and she sent them before she could think about it too carefully. Elias Vance wrote back in 12 days. His handwriting was neat and even, which she noticed because men's handwriting was usually not. He wrote about the ranch, plus 7,000 acres in the foothills east of the Bitterroot Range, cattle operation, 2 hired men, a house that needed a woman's attention, which he said plainly without any apparent embarrassment. He wrote about his first wife, Margaret, who died of fever 3 years earlier, briefly and without much elaboration, the way men write about grief when they're not ready to write about grief. He asked Clara questions, real ones. What did she think about? What did she read? What did she want from the years she had left? Nobody had ever asked Clara what she wanted from the years she had left. She wrote back. He wrote back. 8 months of letters, back and forth, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, Clara had made the mistake of hoping. Not quietly, the way she usually hoped for things, tucked low, armored against disappointment. She'd hoped loudly, privately, in the center of herself, in the way that makes the eventual impact so much worse. She told her landlady, Mrs. Fenwick, who patted her hand and said carefully, "I'm sure he sounds very nice in letters, dear." She told the two women she worked with at the milliner's, who were genuinely pleased for her, genuinely, which made them probably the first two people in Clara's adult life to feel that way. She did not tell her mother, because her mother would have told her to think realistically. She sold her furniture, she gave her notice at the milliner's. She packed 2 trunks, one large, one small, with everything that mattered, and she bought a train ticket to Billings and then a stagecoach fare from Billings west into Hargrove County. And she sat on that stagecoach for 3 days with her large trunk strapped to the roof and her small one wedged between her feet. And she watched Montana happen outside the window. The scale of it, the distances, the way the sky here was bigger than anything she'd ever had to reckon with. And she felt, for the first time in a long time, like something was beginning. The stagecoach dropped her at the crossroads outside the Hargrove County settlement, which was less a town than a collection of buildings that had agreed to stand near each other. The driver helped her down. He pointed her down the eastern road and told her the Vance property was about 4 miles. She walked it. She walked it with the small trunk in her hand and the large one balanced across one of the horses the stagecoach had brought along, which the driver let her borrow as far as the Vance gate, which she was grateful for. Her boots were wrong for the terrain. They were city boots, good leather, but narrow-soled, and by the time she crested the last ridge and saw the ranch house below, the back of her right heel was bleeding. She fixed her hair as best she could. She straightened her coat. She took a breath. She walked down to the house. Elias Vance came out onto the porch before she made it halfway up the drive. He was tall. She'd known that from his letters. He'd mentioned it once in passing. And lean in the way that outdoor men get lean hard through the jaw, with sun lines deep around his eyes. He was, if she was being truthful with herself, better looking than she'd allowed herself to imagine, which for a single foolish second made the whole thing feel more possible. Then she saw his face change. It was quick, the change. A man who'd been practiced at hiding his reactions might have managed it, but Elias Vance was apparently not practiced enough, or not expecting to need to be, and so she saw it. The flicker of something across his expression, the reassessment happening in real time. The moment when whatever he'd been expecting gave way to what was actually standing in his drive. She kept walking. She kept her shoulders straight. She'd had a lot of practice at pretending she hadn't seen. "Mr. Vance," she said when she reached the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I wrote you from Ohio." "I know who you are," he said. His voice wasn't cruel, which almost made it worse. It was simply flat, the voice of a man who had already finished deciding and was now in the administrative portion of the problem. The 2 ranch hands near the fence, one young, one older, both pretending to work on something that did not require their full attention, were watching. She knew they were watching. You learn to feel that particular quality of attention when you've been looked at a certain way your whole life. Elias said, "You didn't mention this in your letters?" Clara set her small trunk down. Her heel was throbbing. She said, "Mention what?" He did the thing with his eyes. That single sweep, head to toe, the same one he'd done when she first came into his sightline, and this time he didn't look away quickly. He let it land. "I have a reputation in this county," he said. "I need a wife who can stand beside me in public without people talking." "I wasn't aware," Clara said carefully, "that your letters contained a weight requirement." She heard one of the ranch hands make a sound that could have been a cough. Something moved across Elias's face. Irritation, possibly. Maybe something else. Something that looked briefly like discomfort, like a man who knows the thing he's doing is unkind but has decided to do it anyway. "I'm not trying to be cruel," he said. "I'm being honest with you." "You're being honest with me," she repeated. "You misrepresented yourself." The word hit her like a flat stone. Misrepresented. As though she'd lied. As though she had written to him under false pretenses. As though the person in those letters, the woman who'd told him about her father's death and her years at the milliner's and the book she'd read 4 times because it was the only one that ever made her feel less alone. As though that person wasn't real. As though she'd sent a copy of herself. "I wrote you 8 months of letters," she said. Her voice was steady. She was not going to let it not be steady. Every one of them was true. Letters don't tell a man everything he needs to know. Clearly, she said, and that one landed too. She could see it, but he didn't move. He picked up her trunk himself, the small one, at his feet, and set it down again at the top of the porch steps. Facing out, a clear and deliberate gesture. You're not coming in. You're going back. I'll have one of the men drive you back to town, he said. You can take the stage back to Billings. Clara looked at the trunk. She looked at him. She thought about the furniture she'd sold. She thought about Mrs. Fenwick's careful face and the two women at the milliner's who had been genuinely happy for her. She thought about 4 pages written on a Tuesday evening in February, written before she could talk herself out of it. Back to what? She said. Elias said nothing. I sold my room, she said. I gave my job away. I walked 4 miles from that crossroads on a bleeding heel because I believed that the man I had written to for 8 months was a man who... She stopped. She pressed her lips together. She was not going to do this in front of the ranch hands. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to honor the correspondence we've had and give this a reasonable attempt. Miss Whitmore. His voice was quieter now, which was not kinder, just lower. I'm sorry you've come all this way. I am. But I can't give my children a mother who... He seemed to search for the word. He settled on, who will be a source of embarrassment. There it was. Not the word he danced around. The real one. Embarrassment. She was an embarrassment. Her body, her size. The thing that had preceded every other judgment people had ever made of her. She was an embarrassment to a man she'd never met in person. A man who had written her letters about Margaret and the cattle market and the way the foothills looked in early October. A man who had asked her what she wanted from the years she had left. She picked up her small trunk. She did not say anything else because there was nothing that would have made any difference. And she knew it. And she had spent 31 years learning the difference between a door that was locked and a door that simply didn't exist. She turned and walked back up the drive. The young ranch hand near the fence looked at the ground when she passed. The older one, gray-bearded, weathered, with the look of a man who had seen enough of the world to be tired of certain parts of it, met her eyes for a moment. Not with pity, with something more complicated than that. She didn't stop to interpret it. She walked back up the ridge. She walked back down the other side. The light was failing by the time she reached the crossroads, and the stagecoach was long gone, and the settlement was a quarter-mile north, and she had $4.60 in a trunk with everything she owned, and a bleeding heel, and nowhere, specifically, to go. She sat down on her trunk at the side of the road, and she breathed. The sky over Montana was doing something she'd never seen a sky do, layering itself in colors she didn't have names for, purple, going dark at the edges, and she would have found it beautiful under different circumstances, she thought. And for some reason, that was the thing that nearly broke her. Not the rejection, not the walk, the sky being beautiful when she was not in a position to appreciate it. She didn't cry. She'd cried earlier, in private, on the stagecoach, pressed against the window where no one could see, and she'd used that up, and now she was simply sitting with the particular hollowness of a hope that has been validated enough to grow and then taken away before it could become anything real. She thought about her mother. Think realistically, Clara. She thought about what realistic looked like from here, from this crossroads, with the sky going dark and no stage until morning. She thought about the milliners and whether Mrs. Partridge would take her back and whether she could get her room again and whether she could rebuild the furniture from nothing and the whole architecture of a life she'd carefully dismantled was sitting somewhere behind her, in pieces. And she would have to go back and reassemble it, and nobody would be surprised. And that was almost the worst part. Nobody would be surprised. The wind picked up. She pulled her coat tighter. She'd been sitting there perhaps 20 minutes when the temperature dropped in a way that didn't feel like evening. It felt like a warning. She looked up. The colored sky had gone solid gray while she'd been staring at the ground, and the gray was moving in a way that she didn't know enough about Montana weather to understand, but that her body seemed to recognize anyway, some animal instinct pulling at the back of her neck. She picked up her trunk and started walking north toward the settlement lights, and the first drops hit before she made it 50 yards. Not rain, not gentle rain, Montana rain in October, which is a different thing entirely. Cold and sideways and immediate. The kind of rain that soaks through a coat in 3 minutes and through everything under it in 5. She walked faster. The road turned to mud under her boots. Her trunk was heavy, and her arms were shaking, and her heel had started bleeding again through the bandage she'd fashioned from her spare handkerchief. The road forked. She took the left fork because it seemed to go toward lights, and then the lights disappeared, and she wasn't sure she'd taken the right fork, and the rain was loud enough to fill her ears, and she walked for what felt like a long time, and the settlement never materialized, and at some point she realized she was not on a road anymore. She was in the dark, in the rain, in the foothills east of the Bitterroot Range, and she was completely alone, and she stopped walking and stood still and tried to think. Her mother's voice. Think realistically, Clara. She was thinking as realistically as she knew how. The rain was real. The dark was real. The cold working its way through her coat and into her shoulders and down her arms was very real. She'd left Ohio for this. She'd sold her furniture for this. She'd walked 4 miles on a bleeding heel and been told she was an embarrassment, and now she was standing in a Montana rainstorm without a road under her feet or a light in sight. The trunk fell from her hands because her arms gave out, not because she let go of it, and she stood there in the rain and the mud, and she looked up at the sky and she said, out loud, to no one, "What am I supposed to do now?" The storm didn't answer, but something else did. A sound. Not thunder, though thunder was rolling somewhere to the west. A different sound, below the rain. She turned toward it, a light moving low to the ground, coming through the trees to her right. A lantern, she realized, swinging from someone's hand as they moved between the pines. Someone walking fast, and she nearly didn't call out, nearly let them pass, because 31 years of being Clara Whitmore had made her cautious about asking for things, cautious about the look on people's faces when they turned and saw what was asking, but the cold was past caution. "Hello?" she called. Her voice came out rougher than she expected, scraped by the rain. "Hello. I'm lost. Please." The lantern stopped. Then it turned toward her. She couldn't see his face yet, just the shape of a man, broad-shouldered, in a coat that had seen considerable weather, moving toward her through the trees with the lantern held out ahead of him. He moved like someone who knew this terrain well enough not to hurry through it, careful without being slow. He came close enough that the lantern light reached her face. He looked at her, at all of her, at the ruined coat and the mud and the trunk on the ground and the rain running down her face. And then he looked at her face specifically, not the way Elias Vance had looked at her, not with that sweeping assessment, but directly, the way you look at a person when you're trying to figure out what they need. "You're hurt," he said. She looked down at her boot. The blood had soaked through the leather. "It's just a heel," she said. "Can you walk on it?" "I've been walking on it for hours." He looked at her for another moment. Then he bent down and picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing significant and tucked it under one arm and held the lantern out toward her with the other hand. "Then walk," he said. "I've got a ranch about a half-mile east. You can get warm, and then we'll figure out the rest." He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask her what she was doing in a Montana rainstorm alone after dark with a bleeding heel and a trunk full of everything she owned. He just held the lantern out and waited. She took it. She didn't know yet that his name was Caleb Hawthorne, or that he had 7 children, or that the half-mile east would turn out to be the most important half-mile of her life. She just knew that he'd turned his lantern toward her without flinching, and in that moment, that was enough. She walked. The half-mile Caleb Hawthorne had promised turned out to be longer than that. Or maybe it just felt longer because Clara was moving through mud and dark with a lantern she kept switching between hands and a heel that had stopped hurting in a specific way and started hurting in a general bone-deep way that she'd learned meant the body was done complaining and had moved on to simply enduring. Caleb didn't talk much on the walk. He carried her trunk under one arm and walked slightly ahead, not so far that she lost sight of him, but far enough that he wasn't hovering, wasn't watching her struggle and waiting to comment on it. She noticed that. She noticed most things, and she noticed that. The rain let up slightly, not enough to matter, just enough to go from punishing to merely miserable. She could hear cattle somewhere in the dark, the low, uncomplicated sound of animals that didn't particularly care about the weather. Then there were lights ahead. 2 windows of a house, both lit warm from inside, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight. The house was larger than she'd expected. Not grand. Nothing about it suggested any interest in being grand, but solid and sprawling in the way that frontier buildings grow when they're added onto over years rather than built all at once. A covered porch ran along the front, which was where Caleb stopped and set her trunk down and pushed open the door without knocking, which meant it was his house, which she'd assumed, but it was still a strange thing to step into someone else's home at night in the rain without any of the ordinary social formalities that normally preceded such a thing. The warmth hit her first. Then the noise. There were children everywhere. Not literally everywhere, but it took her a moment to sort them out because they were at various stages of motion. A boy of about 12 frozen midway through some argument with a younger girl, a small child sitting directly in front of the fireplace, who turned and stared at Clara with the particular open assessment that only very young children and very old people can get away with. 2 more somewhere in the back of the room engaged in something that was generating a scraping sound she couldn't identify. And in the kitchen doorway, a girl of maybe 15 or 16 with her father's same straight jaw and a dish towel over her shoulder, looking at Clara with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was measuring, definitely measuring. The argument between the older boy and the younger girl stopped the moment the door opened. Everyone looked at Clara. Clara looked at all of them. Caleb set her trunk against the wall and said, without preamble, to the room in general, "She was caught in the storm. She's staying until morning. Maddie, heat some water." The girl in the kitchen doorway, Maddie, looked at Clara for another half-second and then turned without comment and disappeared back into the kitchen. The older boy opened his mouth. Caleb looked at him and he closed it again. "Sit," Caleb said to Clara, and gestured toward the chair nearest the fire. And she sat in it without argument because her legs had been planning to give out anyway, and this way she could pretend it was a choice. The small child in front of the fire, a boy, she thought, maybe 4 or 5, with a shock of dark hair and a serious face, turned fully around to face her and said, "You're wet." "I know," she said. "Your face is wet." "Yes." "Papa's face isn't wet." "Your papa is better at storms than I am." The child considered this. Apparently it satisfied him because he turned back to the fire without further comment. The older boy, she'd learn later his name was Thomas, 13 years old, and at that particular age where boys are simultaneously certain of everything and deeply unsure of everything, said to Caleb, "Who is she?" "A woman who needed help," Caleb said, and hung his coat on the hook by the door, and that apparently was the end of the explanation as far as he was concerned. Maddie came back from the kitchen with a basin of hot water and set it on the floor near Clara's feet, without being asked, and then looked at her boot and said, "You should take that off. It's soaked through." "I know." "Are you going to?" Clara looked at her. Maddie looked back. She had the directness of a girl who'd been running a household for long enough that she'd stopped having patience for indirection. "Yes," Clara said. "I'm going to." Getting the boot off was not a dignified process. The leather had dried and then been re-soaked, and the whole thing had stiffened around her foot in a way that required some determined pulling, and by the time she got it off, she had an audience of 3. The small child had rotated back around, and 2 more children had materialized from the back of the room, a girl of about 8 and a boy slightly younger, both watching with the frank curiosity of people who have not yet learned that staring is considered impolite. The back of her heel was ugly. She'd known it would be. She'd been walking on it for hours. But seeing it was still unpleasant. A blister that had opened some time on the walk from the Vance property, raw and red and angry looking, with the dried blood she'd noticed earlier and some fresh blood from the walk through the storm. "That's bad," the 8-year-old girl said helpfully. "Hannah," Maddie said. "It is bad," Hannah said, with the logic of a child who could not understand why identifying a true thing was problematic. "It's fine," Clara said. "I've had worse." This was not true. She could not immediately think of a specific time she'd had worse, but it seemed like the right thing to say. Caleb came back from wherever he'd gone. She hadn't noticed him leave, with a strip of clean cloth and a small jar of something. He set them down on the floor beside the basin and then stood up and looked at her, and seemed to realize he was going to have to be more specific about his intention. "It'll need cleaning," he said. "I can do it." "Probably." He didn't move. She picked up the cloth and wet it in the basin and cleaned the heel herself, which hurt considerably more than she allowed her face to show, and then she looked at the jar and looked at him. "What is it?" "Calendula and pine resin. Maddie makes it." He paused. "It works." She opened the jar and the smell hit her, sharp and green and slightly medicinal, and she applied it, and it did hurt, and then it hurt less, which she supposed was the point. She wrapped the clean cloth around her heel and sat back, and the small child in front of the fire had lost interest again and returned to whatever he'd been doing, which appeared to involve trying to make two sticks stand upright against each other, with mixed results. "Thank you," she said. Caleb nodded once and went to the kitchen. Clara sat in the chair by the fire and let the warmth work its way through her coat and then through the layers under her coat and into the cold that had settled in her shoulders and the back of her neck. The house smelled like wood smoke and something cooking and the faint smell of animals that lives in places where animals are a working part of daily life, and under all of it, something she couldn't name for a moment, something that took her until the fire popped and the small child laughed at the sound to identify. It smelled like a house that was lived in, fully, practically, imperfectly lived in, not maintained, not preserved, used. She hadn't been in a house like that in a long time. Maddie brought her a bowl of something, a stew of some kind, beef and root vegetables, not subtle, but hot and real, and set it on the small table beside the chair without ceremony and went back to the kitchen. Clara ate it. She ate all of it, faster than was polite, and then sat with the empty bowl and felt the specific exhaustion that comes after the body has been frightened and then fed. Thomas had resumed his argument with the younger girl, whose name she would learn was Bess, aged 10, and who appeared to be winning. The argument was about something that had happened that afternoon involving a fence and a goat and some degree of blame that each party felt should rest with the other. Clara listened to it without intending to and found herself forming an opinion about who was actually at fault, which she kept to herself. She heard Caleb's voice from the kitchen, low, talking to Maddie. She couldn't make out the words. She heard Maddie respond, and whatever she said made Caleb quiet for a moment, and then he said something else, quieter, and that was all. The child in front of the fire, the small one with the serious face, had abandoned the sticks and come to stand beside her chair. He was looking at her with the kind of sustained focus that children that age deploy without self-consciousness. "What's your name?" he asked. "Clara," she said. He thought about this. "I'm Eli," he said. "I'm 5. "That's a good age to be." "Papa says you were in the storm." "I was." "Were you scared?" She looked at him. He was asking genuinely, the way children ask things, without the adult impulse to soften or deflect. "Yes," she said. "A little." "Papa says storms are just weather," Eli said. "He says being scared of them is normal, but they pass." "Your papa sounds like a sensible man." Eli nodded. This confirmed something he'd already known. He climbed up onto the rug in front of the fire and lay down with his head on his hands and was asleep in approximately 4 minutes, the way small children sleep, completely and without negotiation, as though sleep were simply the next thing on a list. She watched him for a moment. Then she looked around the room, at Thomas and Bess still going back and forth about the goat, at the 2 younger children who'd returned to their scraping project in the corner, at the fire going steady and warm. And she felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Not happiness exactly. More like the recognition of something. The outline of something she'd been trying to picture for a long time, not clearly enough to describe, but clearly enough to know it when she was sitting inside it. She pushed the feeling away. She was here for one night. She was here because a man with a lantern had been walking through the right patch of trees at the right moment, and in the morning she'd be back on the road to the settlement, and from there back to Billings, and from there back to Ohio, where Mrs. Partridge might or might not take her back, and Mrs. Fenwick's rooms might or might not be available, and the life she'd dismantled would wait to be rebuilt, piece by patient piece. She fell asleep in the chair. She didn't mean to. One moment she was watching the fire, and the next she was not watching anything. She woke up to gray light through the window and a blanket that had been laid across her that had not been there when she fell asleep. Someone had done that without waking her, which required either particular quietness or particular exhaustion on her part, and she suspected it was some of both. The house was quiet, early quiet, the kind that exists for about 30 minutes on a working ranch before the animals make it impossible. She could hear someone moving in the kitchen. She could hear wind outside, but not rain. She folded the blanket carefully and set it on the chair and stood up, testing her heel. It held. It would hurt if she pushed it, but it held. She found her boot where she'd left it and worked it back on, slowly. Caleb was in the kitchen. He was at the stove with his back to her, and he didn't turn around when she came in, but he said, "Coffee," and nodded toward a cup on the table, which meant he'd heard her coming, which meant she wasn't as quiet as she'd thought. She sat down and took the cup. The coffee was strong enough to be a statement. "The rain stopped," she said, "few hours ago. I should get back to the settlement." He turned around then and looked at her. He had the face of a man who'd been up for a while already. Not tired exactly, but the settled, unguarded look of someone who'd been alone with his thoughts before anyone else was awake. "Stage doesn't come through until Thursday," he said. She stared at him. "It's Tuesday," he said. She looked down at her coffee. Tuesday. 2 days. She had $4.60 and a heel that was not going to thank her for 4 miles of walking and no clear place to go if she did walk it. "I can't stay here," she said. "Wasn't asking you to stay," he said. "Was telling you the stage situation." He turned back to the stove. "But if you want to sleep in the settlement for 2 nights on $4, that's your business." She looked at him. "How do you know I have $4? He glanced back over his shoulder. "You looked in your purse last night when you were half asleep. Wasn't hard to see the situation." She didn't know what to say to that, so she drank her coffee. He said, not turning around, "I've got 7 children and no help, and a fence line that needs repair before the first hard freeze. If you want to earn your board for 2 days, I won't stop you." "You don't know anything about me." "I know you walked 4 miles on a bleeding heel and didn't complain about it," he said. "That's more than I know about most people." It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an observation. But there was something in it that sat differently in her chest than compliments usually did. Maybe because it was specific, maybe because it was true. She said, "What needs doing?" He told her. The list was longer than 2 days. She could see that immediately, not because he was trying to mislead her, but because the list was the list of a household that had been running below capacity for some time, not catastrophically, but steadily. The way things run when the person who used to manage half of it is no longer there. The mending that had accumulated, the preserves that hadn't been put up. The youngest 2 children who were behind where they should be in their letters and numbers because there hadn't been anyone with the time to sit with them consistently. She didn't point any of that out. She said, "Oh, all right," and drank the rest of her coffee. The first day was harder than she'd expected, which was already accounting for hard. Maddie was not unfriendly, but she was not precisely warm either, and Clara understood that this was Maddie's kitchen, Maddie's household, a 15-year-old girl who'd been holding things together through a combination of capability and stubbornness for long enough that another woman's presence felt like an audit. Clara moved carefully. She asked before she did things. She didn't reorganize anything. When Maddie did something differently than Clara would have done it, Clara did not mention this. Bess was easier, a curious, voluble child who talked in the way that some children talk, as though they're afraid the words will expire if not used promptly. She told Clara about the goat, about Thomas, about the goat's history with Thomas, about a girl at the settlement school she didn't like, and the reasons for this. Clara listened to all of it. Thomas kept his distance for most of the first day. He watched her when he thought she wasn't watching him, which she was, because watching things was one of Clara's long-standing skills. He was a boy who was trying to figure out what she was and what it meant for the household, and she thought the honest answer was probably complicated enough that she'd let him come to it himself. The younger 2, the ones who were behind in their letters, were named James, 6, and Nora, 7. She found them in the afternoon in the corner of the main room where they'd been the night before, engaged in what turned out to be an attempt to build something with mismatched pieces of wood. She sat down on the floor beside them without announcement and said, What are you building? James looked at her. A barn. She looked at what they had. The door's going to be in a tricky spot, she said. They both looked at the door's spot. They both saw the problem. Nora said, "We could move it." "That would work," Claire said. She didn't take over. She didn't fix it. She just sat with them while they moved the door and encountered 3 more problems, and worked through 2 of them and got frustrated on the 3rd. When they got frustrated, she said, "What if?" and put a question to them rather than a solution, and let them find the solution themselves. And the barn got built, lopsided and structurally implausible but standing, and both children looked at it with the satisfaction of people who have made a thing. She taught them 4 letters that afternoon. She made it part of the barn. They had to write the letters for the materials they'd used: wood and nail and floor and door. James was quicker than he'd been given credit for. Nora was more careful, and her letters were better. Caleb came in from the fence line at dusk and found them at the table with the paper and saw Clara's head bent next to Nora's, correcting the angle of a letter, and he stood in the doorway for a moment without anyone noticing him. She didn't know he was there until she heard the door. He didn't say anything about what he'd seen. He said the fence was worse than he'd thought, and he'd need another day on it at least. She said she'd work on the preserves in the morning. He said Maddie had been trying to get to them for 3 weeks. She said she'd see what she could do. They ate dinner, all 9 of them at a table designed for 8, which meant someone always had one elbow off the edge. And tonight that someone was Clara. And Thomas told a story about something that had happened with the cattle that afternoon that was clearly embellished in at least 3 places, and she watched Caleb listen to it with the particular attention of a father who is hearing the performance version of the story and is choosing to enjoy the performance. After dinner, when the children were in varying stages of going to bed, and Caleb was at the table with his account book doing the kind of arithmetic that clearly wasn't adding up the way he wanted, she sat across from him and said, "Can I ask you something?" He looked up. "What happened to your wife?" He was quiet for a moment, not offended. The question didn't land that way, just thinking about how to answer it or whether to, and she watched him decide. "Fever," he said. 3 years ago, February. She was sick 4 days. He looked back at the account book. Margaret she was good at this. All of it. The house, the children. I'm good at the cattle and the land. The rest of it, I've been figuring out as I go. You've done well. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Maddie's done well. I've kept everyone alive. Those aren't always different things. He looked at her again. He had eyes that were hard to read, not because he was closed off exactly, but because he seemed to process things slowly and carefully, and whatever he was processing took time to surface. "Why are you out here?" he said. "In Montana. Alone." So she told him. She didn't dress it up, and she didn't leave things out. She told him about the advertisement and the letters, and the 8 months, and the walk from the crossroads, and what Elias Vance had said on his porch with the ranch hands listening. She told it flatly, the way you tell things when you've already moved past the part where they make you cry. When she finished, Caleb was quiet for a long time. "Vance," he said. The word had a texture to it. "You know him." "Know of him. He and his father bought up a lot of land in this county, not always through means that held up to looking at closely." He paused. "He's a man who thinks a great deal of what other people think of him." I noticed. "What are you going to do?" "Go back to Ohio," she said. "Rebuild." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "You were good with James and Nora today." She looked at him. "The letters," he said. "Nora's been struggling with her bees for a month. She had them right tonight." Clara looked down at the table. She just needed someone to show her the angle. She needed someone with the patience to show her, he said. "That's different." She didn't answer. She looked at the account book instead. The columns he'd been working on, and the numbers that weren't adding up, and the things she was good at, the things she'd always been good at, the fast and orderly mind that people always underestimated because it lived in a body they'd already decided about. "May I?" she said, and gestured at the book. He turned it toward her. She looked at the columns for maybe 2 minutes. She found the error, a transposed figure in the 3rd column that had cascaded through the subsequent calculations, and pointed to it. He looked at it, then he looked at her. That's 3 hours of work, he said. 40 minutes if the column's already set up, she said. The rest of it just flows from fixing that one number. He sat back in his chair and looked at her in the way he'd looked at her when she first came out of the storm. Not assessing, but direct. Trying to understand something. You're not going back to Ohio, he said. It wasn't a statement, and it wasn't quite a question. I don't know what I'm doing, she said honestly. Thursday's a few days away, he said. The fence won't fix itself, and the preserves need doing, and James and Nora could use someone to sit with them. She looked at him. I'm not offering charity, he said, and his voice was careful and clear. I'm offering fair work for fair board, and I'd shake your hand on it the same as I would any hired man. I'm not a hired man. No, he said. You're considerably more useful than the last one. She almost laughed. She didn't, quite, but she almost did. I'll stay through the end of the month, she said. We'll see from there. He nodded. He turned the account book around and picked up his pencil and fixed the transposed number. Then he went back to his columns, and she sat across the table from him in the warmth of the house that smelled like wood smoke and children and a life being lived. And outside, the wind moved through the Montana foothills and the cattle settled, and the October sky did whatever it was going to do. And Clara Whitmore sat with her hands folded on the table and thought that she did not know exactly what this was, but it was something, and after the last 3 days, something was enough. She stayed through the end of the month, and then she stayed through November. And one afternoon, in the second week of December, when the first real snow had come down overnight, and everything outside was white and quiet, and James came running into the kitchen to announce it as though no one had ever seen snow before. And Clara looked up from the bread she was making and saw his face, pure, uncomplicated joy, the face of a 6-year-old who has just remembered that the world contains things like snow. She felt something settle in her chest that she'd never quite felt before. Not happiness, exactly. More like recognition. This, she thought, this is what I was trying to get to. She pressed her hands back into the dough, and James ran back outside, and she could hear him yelling something to Nora, and then Nora's answering yell, and the bread rose even in the cold kitchen, and outside the snow kept coming down, and Clara kept working. The snow that came in December stayed through February, which was how Montana worked, and Clara learned this the way she learned most things about the territory. Not from being told, but from living inside it until it stopped surprising her. She learned that the Hawthorne Ranch sat at an elevation that made the winters harder than the settlements, and that Caleb had chosen this land deliberately, years ago, because the summer grass at this height was better than anything lower, and that he had calculated the trade-off with the same quiet arithmetic he applied to everything. She learned that Thomas, for all his 13-year-old posturing, was the most reliable of the children in a genuine emergency, the one who moved toward a problem rather than away from it. She learned that Maddie's apparent coolness was not coldness, but watchfulness. The girl had been watching adults fail her household for 3 years, and she was still waiting to see whether Clara would prove different. The proving took time. That was the honest truth of it. It wasn't a single moment. It was the accumulation of mornings where Clara got up before she wanted to and did the thing that needed doing without being asked. It was the week in January when Nora had a fever that climbed too high, and Clara sat with her through 2 nights straight, changing the cool cloths on her forehead and talking to her in a low voice about nothing in particular, just to give her something to follow back toward wakefulness. It was the afternoon Maddie came in from the cold with a burned hand. She'd grabbed a pot handle without thinking, and Clara took her hand and looked at it and said, "Sit," in a voice that didn't ask, and got the calendula jar and sat across from Maddie at the kitchen table and treated the burn with the same care Maddie had given Clara's heel on the first night, and neither of them mentioned this parallel, but both of them knew it was there. After that, Maddie started talking to her differently. Not softly. Maddie was not a soft girl, and Clara would not have trusted soft from her, but directly, without the layer of management that had been there before. By the time March came and the snow began its slow, muddy retreat, Clara had stopped counting the days. She'd written to her mother in January 1 letter, factual, short. She'd told her where she was and what she was doing, not in a way that invited the conversation about thinking realistically, but in a way that made clear she wasn't lost and wasn't in trouble and didn't currently need anything. Her mother wrote back in 6 weeks. The mail in and out of the territory was unreliable at the best of times, and the letter was careful in a way that told Clara her mother was trying. She didn't say, "I told you so," though the space where it would have gone was still visible. She asked about the children. Clara wrote back with more detail. The matter of what exactly she was to the Hawthorne household had not been formally resolved. She did the work of a household manager, the cooking and preserving and mending and the letters and numbers with James and Nora, who were both ahead of where they'd been by the time the spring thaw arrived. She kept the account books with an accuracy that had relieved Caleb of a burden he'd been carrying badly, not because he was careless with money, but because he was a man who thought in land and cattle and weather, not in columns. She received her board and a small wage that she saved with the same careful attention she'd given to money her entire adult life, every dollar placed with purpose. What she and Caleb were to each other was a question they had not directly addressed. They talked. That much was certain. More than she'd expected from a man who used so few words when words weren't required. In the evenings after the children were in bed, when the house went quiet in that specific way that only happens after a loud day, they sat at the kitchen table. Him with the account book or a catalog or sometimes just a cup of coffee and nothing particular. And they talked about the ranch, about the children, about what had gone right that day and what hadn't. He told her once, haltingly, about Margaret. Not about her death, but about who she'd been, the kind of woman she was. Practical and sharp-tongued and deeply loved by the children in the way that competent mothers are loved, which is differently than the way gentle ones are. Clara listened without trying to fill the silences. Once, in February, he'd said to her, out of no particular context, "You don't talk about yourself much." She'd considered that. "There's not always much to say." "That's not why," he said. She'd looked at him. "You're careful," he said, "about what you offer. You watch first." She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Most of the time when I've not been careful, it hasn't served me well." He nodded slowly, the way he did when something confirmed something he'd already been thinking. He didn't push it further. That was one of the things about him that she was still getting used to, the absence of pressure. She'd spent so much of her life around people who made their expectations felt as a constant weight that the lack of it from Caleb sometimes felt like a space she didn't know how to stand in. Spring in Montana arrived less like a season and more like an argument. 3 days of warmth, then a late freeze, then a week of mud, then something that could almost be called April. Caleb started the season with the fence repairs he hadn't finished before winter had interrupted everything, and he hired a temporary hand named Owen, a quiet young man of about 20 who did his work without complaint and had the good sense not to ask a lot of questions about the household arrangement, which Clara appreciated. It was Owen who told her, without meaning anything by it, on a Tuesday morning in late April when she was hanging washing and he was walking from the barn to the main pasture. "Saw Elias Vance in the settlement yesterday. He was at the land office." She didn't react in any visible way. She kept hanging the washing. She said. "Thought you might want to know," Owen said, "knowing how you came to be here and all." She looked at him. "Maddie told me," he said, not defensively. "Not to gossip, just to explain." She nodded once. He went on to the pasture. She finished hanging the washing with hands that were steady and a mind that was moving fast. Elias Vance at the land office could mean nothing. Men went to land offices. It was where business got done. But Elias Vance specifically, in April, in a county where Caleb Hawthorne ran the second largest cattle operation, with a fence line that was still being repaired and land documents that Clara had spent February reorganizing because they'd been kept in a way that was, charitably, informal, that combination of facts sat in her chest like a stone with edges. She mentioned it to Caleb that evening. She said it plainly. Owen saw Vance at the land office. Caleb's face didn't change much, but something in his posture did. He set his coffee cup down. "What business would he have there?" she said. "Vance has been buying land in this county for 3 years, Caleb said. "Quietly, mostly. Some of it straight purchase, some of it—" He stopped. "Some of it through other means." "What means?" He looked at her. "There are ranchers to the south of here who signed papers they didn't fully read, ended up with liens on property they thought they owned outright. Vance's man does the paperwork." He paused. Harlan Price. He's the county clerk. Clara sat with that for a moment. How much of your paperwork is in order? She said. Most of it. Most. He was quiet. Caleb. Her voice was even. How much of your paperwork is in order? He rubbed the back of his neck, which was, she had learned, the gesture he made when he was about to admit something he wasn't comfortable admitting. The deed on the north parcel hasn't been updated since my father's time, he said. I've been meaning to get to it. When did your father file it? 61. She closed her eyes for a half second. 61. 15 years. In a territory where land law had been rewritten twice in the intervening period, where county records were kept by a man who appeared to be in business with Elias Vance. I need to see all of it, she said. The original deed, everything you have on the north parcel, anything you've signed in the last 3 years related to the land. Clara, I need to see all of it, she said again, not louder, but in a different register. The register that meant this was not a point she was willing to be talked past. He got the papers. She spread them out on the kitchen table that night after the children were in bed, and she went through them the way she went through the account books, systematically, without rushing, looking for the thing that wasn't right. It took her until past midnight. When she found it, she sat very still for a moment. There was a document from 1873, 2 years ago, that Caleb had signed. It was filed as a routine maintenance agreement with the county, the kind of thing the clerk's office sometimes required for water rights confirmation. Caleb had signed it because Harlan Price had brought it to him at the ranch and told him it was a formality. It was not a formality. The language buried in the third paragraph of the second page established a conditional right of claim on any parcel with an unresolved deed dispute in Hargrove County, assignable to any party who filed a competing title within the statutory window. It was written in the kind of legal language that is designed to be misread, syntax bent into shapes that looked straightforward until you untangled them. She read it 3 times. Then she went and knocked on Caleb's bedroom door. He opened it in the way of a man who hadn't been fully asleep. She held out the document and pointed to the third paragraph. He read it. She watched his face. Tell me I'm reading this wrong, he said. You're not reading it wrong. He looked up. His expression was not panic. It was something harder than panic, the look of a man who has been outmaneuvered and is now calculating exactly how badly. He's going to file on the north parcel, Caleb said. I think that's the plan, yes. The north parcel is 600 acres. It's the best of what I have. I know. He put the document down on the hallway table and stood there with his hands at his sides. And Clara had seen him tired, and she'd seen him worried, and she'd seen him frustrated with the children and the land and the weather, but she hadn't seen him look like this, like the ground had shifted under him and he was trying to find where the solid parts were. What can I do? He said. It wasn't quite a question. File first, she said, Imbo. You need to get to the land office before Vance does and file a corrected deed on the north parcel. If the corrected deed is on record before he files the competing title, the 1873 document's conditional clause doesn't attach. Price runs the land office. I know. He's not going to help me. No, she said. But there's a territorial land registry in Billings that supersedes the county office. If you file there, Price can't interfere with the filing. He looked at her. How do you know that? He said. I worked in a milliner's shop in Ohio for 8 years, she said. But before that, I worked 2 years in my uncle's law office copying documents. She paused. I was very good at reading legal language. It was actually the only thing my uncle said I was useful for. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, When do I need to leave? Tomorrow morning, earliest stage. He nodded once. He picked up the document. Come in, he said, gesturing toward the small front room that served as what could be called, loosely, a study. Help me write down exactly what I need to say. They sat at the small desk in the front room until 2 a.m, and she walked him through the precise language he'd need to use with the Billings registry, the specific citation of the 1861 deed, the corrective filing process, the fee structure, the timeline. She wrote notes in her clean, even hand, and he read them over and asked questions that told her he was following everything, not just trusting her to know, actually following it himself, and she found that she respected him more for it. He left on the 6:30 stage. He came back 2 days later with a filed receipt from the Billings Territorial Registry and the beginning of an expression she'd seen on people's faces when they've been lucky and know it and are still processing the texture of how close it was. "Done?" she said. "Done," he said. She let out a breath. "Price is going to be upset," Caleb said. "Price was going to file Vance's competing title at the end of the month," she said. "He'll figure out it won't work, and Vance will figure out what happened, and yes, they're both going to be upset." She looked at him. "But the land is yours." He sat down at the kitchen table. He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy and had just set it down and was feeling both lighter and somewhat strange about it. "You knew what that document was the minute you saw it," he said. "I had a feeling when Owen told me about Vance at the land office," she said. "I was hoping I was wrong." "What made you look for it specifically?" "Because Vance is a man who does his damage with paper," she said, "not with force. With documents nobody reads closely enough." She sat down across from him. "I've had some experience with how that works." He understood what she meant. She saw it on his face, the connection back to the porch in October, to what kind of man Elias Vance was, to the particular cruelty of someone who uses the machinery of respectability as a weapon. What happened next happened the way things sometimes do, not dramatically, not with any clear beginning, but with a kind of accumulation of moments that eventually makes a different kind of sense. It happened in the settlement, on a Saturday in May, at the dry goods store where Clara had taken Bess and James and Nora for supplies. She was at the counter with the list when she heard the voice. "Well, I didn't expect to see you still in the county." Elias Vance was standing near the door, in his good coat with the expression of a man who is accustomed to social advantage and is deploying it now. There were 4 or 5 other people in the store, all of them now very interested in not appearing to listen. Clara looked at him. She had thought about this moment. Not obsessively. She'd had too much else to think about. But in the way you think about things you know are coming, the way you rehearse something not to perform it, but to be sure you know where you actually stand. "Mr. Vance," she said, "I hear you've been keeping house for Hawthorne," he said. His tone was the tone of a man delivering a social verdict. "I imagine it suits you." Bess was at Clara's left side. James was behind her, holding a paper bag of peppermints she'd allowed him to pick out. Nora was looking at Elias Vance with the particular focus of a 7-year-old who knows something is wrong but is still gathering information. "It does suit me," Clara said. "Thank you." She had learned over 31 years that there was a kind of man who expected a reaction, who had calibrated his cruelty to produce one, and who was disarmed by the absence of it. Elias Vance was that kind of man. She could see it, the slight recalibration behind his eyes when she didn't flinch, when she didn't look ashamed, when she simply looked at him the same way she'd look at any person she was addressing. "Word is you've been running Hawthorne's books," he said, "making yourself useful." A pause, waited. "I suppose a woman in your position takes what situations she can get." "I suppose she does," Clara said. "The same as any person." One of the women near the bolts of fabric, a woman Clara knew by sight, a rancher's wife named Helen Marsh who had never spoken to her directly, looked up from what she was examining. "I heard," Elias said with the careful lightness of a man placing a blade, "that you've been positioning yourself to get your hands on Hawthorne's property, given your history with letters and what you represent yourself to be." There it was. The store had gone the particular kind of quiet where everyone is present. Clara set her list down on the counter. She turned to face him fully. "What I represent myself to be," she said, and her voice was steady and clear and audible to everyone in that quiet store, "is a woman who is good with numbers and keeps an honest account and has spent the last 6 months running a household of 7 children with nothing to gain except fair wages for fair work." She let that sit for a second. "If that's what you've heard about me, then you've heard the truth." Elias's jaw tightened. "Your letters," she said, and she let the words settle between them, "told a man who had not yet met you in person a great many things about your character, Mr. Vance. I wonder sometimes how much of that you think about." Helen Marsh had put down the bolt of fabric entirely. "You're a difficult woman," Elias said, and his voice had lost the lightness. No, Clara said. I'm a straightforward one. Those aren't the same thing, though I understand why someone like you would have trouble telling them apart. She picked up her list. She turned back to the counter. She said to the shopkeeper, who had the expression of a man watching a fire he wasn't sure which direction would take, "I'll take 2 pounds of the flour, please, and the salt pork." She heard Elias leave. The door didn't slam, which she thought said something. He was still managing himself, still keeping the surface intact. But he left. The store stayed quiet for a moment. Then Helen Marsh said from the fabric section, to no one in particular, "He sold my cousin's husband land that turned out to have a prior claim on it. Took them 2 years to sort out." A pause. Never did apologize. The shopkeeper started weighing the flour. Bess, at Clara's side, said in a low voice that she thought was quieter than it was, "You didn't even look scared." Clara looked down at her. "I was a little scared," she said honestly. "You didn't look it." "That's different from not being it," Clara said. "Remember that." Bess thought about this with the seriousness she applied to things she was planning to keep. The story of the exchange in the dry goods store moved through the settlement the way stories do in small communities, faster than news, slower than rumor, arriving at each household with a slightly different shape, but with the essential truth intact. Clara was not naive about what this meant. It did not mean she had won anyone over. It meant she had become visible in a different way, and visibility in a place like Hargrove County was a double-edged thing. What she did not anticipate was Elias Vance's response. She should have. She knew what he was. She'd seen it in the document he'd had Price prepare, in the way he'd sent the maintenance agreement to Caleb's ranch, rather than requiring Caleb to come to the office. Because he knew if he made it official, a person looking carefully might see what it was. She knew he was a man who did his damage at angles, who preferred the appearance of propriety to the reality of it, who would not come at something directly if there was an indirect path available. She knew all this, but knowing a thing and anticipating its next shape are different skills. 3 weeks after the exchange in the dry goods store, a letter appeared at the Hargrove County Register, the small newspaper that was printed bi-weekly and circulated through the settlement and to the surrounding ranches. It was not signed. Anonymous letters to small papers were not unusual. The editors of such papers were often more interested in having content than in verifying it. The letter described, in the general terms that allow a thing to be said without being said precisely, a woman of uncertain background and indifferent moral character who had ingratiated herself into the household of a widowed rancher and his children. It mentioned letters sent under false pretenses. It mentioned financial irregularities. It did not use Clara's name, but the description was specific enough that anyone in Hargrove County could read exactly who was meant. Caleb brought the paper in from the gate where it was delivered and stood in the kitchen doorway and held it out to her without comment. She read it. She read it twice. She set it on the table. "Who wrote it?" Caleb said. It was not a question. "Someone who knows how to not write his name on a thing," she said. Caleb's face was doing something she'd seen it do before, but more controlled, slower, the contained version of fury, the kind that burns low and even and is considerably more dangerous than the kind that flares. "I'm going to Vance's ranch," he said. "No," she said. "Clara?" "No," she said again. "That's exactly what he wants. You go out there angry, and whatever happens, he shapes the story. He's good at shaping stories." She looked at the paper. "We need to think about this." He stood there. She could see what it cost him to stand there instead of going. "Sit down," she said. "Please." He sat. She looked at the letter again. Financial irregularities. That was the part with teeth. Because in a county where Harlan Price ran the land office and people were already uncertain about what the woman from Ohio was doing in the Hawthorne household, a whisper of financial impropriety could do damage that yelling at Elias Vance would never undo. "He's trying to make it about money," she said. "Because that's the accusation that makes people look at the books." "The books are clean," Caleb said. "I know that. You know that." She looked at him. "Who else knows that?" He was quiet. "We need to let someone else see them," she said. "Not to prove it to Vance, to prove it to the county. I'm not putting my finances in front of the settlement for public inspection." "I know you don't want to," She kept her voice even. But right now, the story in that paper is the only story some people have. The way you change a story is with a better one. He looked at the paper. She watched him think, which he did slowly and thoroughly all the way around a thing. "I'm not doing it for Vance," he said finally. "No," she said. "You're doing it for the ranch, and for the children, and—" She stopped. "And?" he said. She looked at him. There was a version of what she was about to say that was modest and careful and kept appropriate distance. She'd been good at that version of herself for a long time. "And for me," she said, "because I've been here 6 months and I've given this household everything I have, and I'm not going to let a man who rejected me on his porch in October define what I am to this community." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." He said it quietly, like a man who has made a decision and doesn't need to announce it loudly to mean it. She nodded once. Outside, the May afternoon was going about its business. The cattle in the far pasture, Thomas's voice somewhere near the barn, Eli chasing something in the yard with the focused urgency of a 5-year-old who has identified a purpose. The ranch kept its rhythms regardless of what Elias Vance put in the county paper, which was either comforting or indifferent depending on the moment. She picked up the newspaper. She folded it neatly. She set it beside the stove. There was bread to make and accounts to keep, and 2 children who needed their letters before supper, and the world outside the kitchen window was going on in its ordinary, difficult, continuing way. She washed her hands and got to work. The question of who in Hargrove County would be willing to look at Caleb Hawthorne's account books and say publicly what they found took Clara 2 days to think through carefully. Not because there were no honest people in the settlement. There were. But honesty and willingness to involve oneself in a dispute that had Elias Vance on one side were different things, and she understood that distinction without bitterness. People had their own land, their own families, their own calculations about what risks were worth taking. She couldn't ask someone to stand in front of Vance's influence without understanding what they were standing in front of. She settled on 2 names. The first was Robert Ainsley, who ran the feed supply operation at the edge of the settlement and had done business with Caleb for 7 years. He was not a warm man. She'd met him twice, both times brief, and he had the quality of someone who measured his words before spending them. But he was known throughout the county as a man whose ledgers were clean and whose word, once given, held. More importantly, he had no dealings with Vance and, as far as she could determine, no particular reason to avoid having none. The second was Helen Marsh, whose quiet comment in the dry goods store about her cousin's husband had not left Clara's mind. Helen was a rancher's wife, not a figure of any official standing, but she was well liked in the settlement in the specific way that women who get things done are well liked. Not celebrated exactly, but depended upon. And that kind of standing had its own weight. She put this to Caleb the evening after she'd worked it through. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his qualities she'd come to rely on. "Ainsley will do it if he respects what he sees," she said. "He won't do it as a favor, he'll do it as a matter of record." "And Helen Marsh?" "Helen Marsh already doesn't like Vance, but she's smart enough that she won't say so publicly just because of that. If we give her something real to stand behind, she'll stand behind it." Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. "What exactly are we asking them to do?" "Look at 2 years of accounts. Confirm in writing that the records are accurate and show no irregularities. Ainsley's signature on a statement like that carries weight in this county." She paused. "And I want to go back to the register." He looked at her. "The letter didn't use my name," she said. "That was deliberate. It gives Vance distance from it. But it also means a response that uses my name, specifically, clearly, with facts attached, has more force than the original accusation." She met his eyes. "I want to write a letter to the editor, under my own name." "Clara," his voice was careful, "if you put your name on a public letter in a county paper, I know. It makes you a target." "I'm already a target," she said. "The difference is that right now I'm a target who hasn't spoken. Once I speak, I'm something else." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him work through the same calculation she'd already worked through twice. "What would the letter say?" he said. "The truth," she said. plainly. Nothing he can use against me because the truth doesn't give him anything to use. He set his coffee cup down. He rubbed the back of his neck. She waited. I want to read it before you send it, he said. Of course, she said. Ainsley agreed to look at the books, though he made clear the look would take the time it took, and he would not be rushed, and he would say what he found regardless of what that was, and she told him that was exactly what she was asking for. He came to the ranch on a Thursday, spent 4 hours at the kitchen table with the accounts spread in front of him, while Clara sat nearby in case he had questions, and when he was done, he said without particular ceremony, "These are clean books, better kept than most I've seen in this county." He wrote a statement to that effect in his own hand and signed it, and she thanked him and made him coffee, which he drank standing up, and he left. Helen Marsh required a different kind of conversation. Clara rode out to the Marsh property on a Friday morning on the older of Caleb's 2 horses, which she had been riding well enough by May that the horse had stopped treating her with the polite skepticism he'd shown in the beginning. Helen met her at the door and let her in without particular surprise, as though she'd been expecting something of this kind, which Clara suspected she had. They sat in Helen's kitchen and Clara told her the full version, not just the letter in the paper, but the 1873 document, the North Parcel, price, the dry goods store, all of it, in the same plain way she'd told Caleb about Elias on his porch 6 months ago. Helen listened with her hands folded on the table and her face doing the work of someone who is simultaneously receiving new information and confirming things she'd already suspected. When Clara finished, Helen said, "My cousin's husband wasn't the only one." Clara looked at her. "There's a family named Dutton, east of here, past the ridge. Lost 40 acres 2 years ago through a process none of them understood until after the fact." Helen's voice was even, but there was something moving underneath it. "And the Reinhold widow. She signed something for Price last spring that she thought was a tax filing. She still doesn't know exactly what it was." Clara was very still. "How many people know about these cases?" "The people it happened to," Helen said. "They don't talk about it much. Embarrassment, I think, and fear of what talking about it might cost them." Clara thought about the anonymous letter in the paper, about a man who relied on silence, about how much of his method depended on each person believing they were alone in what had happened to them. "Would the Duttons speak to someone?" Clara said. "Would Mrs. Reinhold?" Helen looked at her for a moment. "What are you planning?" "I don't know exactly yet," Clara said honestly. "But I think Elias Vance has been counting on people not comparing notes." She paused. "He's been counting on everyone thinking their situation is individual." Helen was quiet. Then she said, "You understand what you're getting into?" "I've had some time to think about it." "He has money, and he has Price, and he has the kind of social position in this county that makes people careful," Helen said. "You're a woman who's been here less than a year, no family here, no land, no official standing of any kind." "I know," Clara said. "And you want to go up against him anyway." "I don't want to," Clara said. "But I think someone has to, and I seem to be the person with the clearest view of how his paperwork works." Helen looked at her for a long time. Then she made a sound that was something between a sigh and a decision and said, "I'll talk to the Duttons." The letter Clara wrote to the register took her 4 drafts. The first was too angry. She could feel it in the sentences, the way they leaned forward into accusation. She put that one in the stove. The second was too careful, hedged into uselessness. Gone. The third was better but too long, and she knew from the dry goods store that what carried weight was brevity and clarity, not elaboration. The fourth draft was 1 page. It began by identifying herself by name, her background in Ohio, her occupation at the Hawthorne Ranch, and the nature of the work she did there. It addressed the anonymous letter directly without restating its accusations, which would only spread them further. It cited Ainsley's statement. It said, in plain language, that she had come to Hargrove County under circumstances she had not chosen, had found honest employment and given honest work, and that her account of that employment could be confirmed by anyone who cared to verify it against the documented record. And then, in the last paragraph, she wrote, "I note that the letter which prompted this response carried no name. I understand why some people choose to communicate without signing their work. I have always found, however, that an argument which cannot bear the weight of its author's name is usually an argument that cannot bear much examination at all. She let Caleb read it. He read it twice. He set it on the table. He said, "The last paragraph." "I know," she said. "It's going to make him angry." "He's already angry," she said. "The question is whether his anger stays private or becomes public. If he responds to that letter with his name attached, he's in the open. If he doesn't respond, the letter stands." Caleb looked at it again. Something moved across his face that she'd come to recognize. The expression he had when he'd reached the end of his reservations about something and was preparing to stop having them. "Send it," he said. The letter appeared in the register the following Thursday. By Saturday, Clara was aware, in the specific way that awareness travels in small communities without anyone saying anything directly, that the letter had been read and was being discussed. The Ainsley statement was mentioned in the letter by name, and Ainsley himself confirmed it when asked, which several people apparently did ask. What she had not expected was the Duttons. 3 days after the letter ran, a wagon came up the road to the Hawthorne Ranch and stopped in the yard, and when Clara came out to see who it was, she found a man of about 50 with a weathered face and a set to his jaw that she recognized. The jaw of someone who has decided to do a difficult thing and is doing it before he can reconsider. Beside him on the wagon seat was a woman about the same age, and in the bed of the wagon were 2 grown sons and a stack of documents wrapped in oilcloth. "Mrs. Dutton spoke to Helen Marsh," the man said. His name was Garrett Dutton. "We heard you know something about the kind of paper Price writes." Clara looked at him. She looked at the documents in oilcloth. "Come inside," she said. They were at the kitchen table for 3 hours. The Duttons' situation was worse than she'd expected, and also, once she read the documents, clearer than Price had probably intended. He'd used similar language across multiple filings, which meant the pattern was visible if you had more than one example to compare. She worked through it methodically, while Garrett Dutton watched her with the expression of a man trying to decide whether to trust something he doesn't fully understand yet, and his wife sat with her hands flat on the table and didn't say much, but didn't look away. "This document," Clara said, pointing to a page from 1874, "creates a defeasible claim that was triggered when you missed the 1875 assessment filing. But the 1875 assessment notice was sent to an address you hadn't occupied for 2 years. She looked up. "Did you notify the county office when you moved the main residence to the new building?" Garrett looked at his wife. "We filed something," he said. "Didn't we?" "We tried to," his wife said. "Price's man told us it wasn't necessary." Clara wrote that down. "If you can get anyone to confirm that conversation." "The Reinholdts were there," the younger of the 2 sons said. "We went in together that day. Mrs. Reinhold heard it all." Clara looked at her notes. Then she looked at the oilcloth stack of documents. Then she looked at Garrett Dutton. "I need to tell you honestly," she said. "I'm not a lawyer. What I can do is read these documents and tell you what I find and help you understand what you're looking at. What you do with that is your decision." Garrett looked at her steadily. "What would you do?" he said. "If this were your land." She thought about Caleb's north parcel. She thought about the 1873 document she'd found at midnight, the one Price had brought to the ranch as a formality. "I'd go to Billings," she said, "to the Territorial Land Registry, not the county office, and I'd bring every document you have, including the one that shows the address notification you tried to file, and I'd ask them to review the chain of title on the affected parcel." "That costs money," Garrett said. "It does," she said. "Less than 40 acres. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Would you come with us? To Billings, to help explain what we found?" She had not expected that. She sat with it for a second. "Let me talk to Caleb," she said. Caleb, when she told him that evening, was quiet for longer than usual. She gave him the quiet. She'd learned it was productive with him. "How many families are in the same situation as the Duttons?" he said finally. "I don't know," she said. "Helen thinks at least 3, maybe more. Some of them may not realize it yet." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "If you go to Billings and do this for the Duttons and word gets out, more people will come," she said. Yes. And Price will know what you're doing. He probably already suspects. And Vance? Yes, she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. There was a conversation they hadn't quite had yet about what this was and what they were, and this moment had the quality of sitting on the edge of that conversation without quite stepping into it. You could walk away from this, he said. None of this was your fight to begin with. Vance made it mine when he put a letter in the county paper about me, she said. I didn't choose that. That's not why you're doing it, he said. She looked at him. You're doing it because you're the person who can, he said. And you can't not do a thing you're capable of doing if not doing it means it doesn't get done. He said it without judgment, as an observation, like a man describing a characteristic he'd been studying for a while. She didn't deny it. It would have been dishonest. Will you be all right here for a few days, she said, if I go to Billings? We managed before you came, he said. You managed, she said. Maddie ran everything. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, the shape of one. She still does, he said. Don't tell her I said that, Clara said. She already knows, he said. She left for Billings on a Monday with Garrett Dutton and his younger son, and the oilcloth stack of documents, and her own notes from 3 hours at the kitchen table and several subsequent evenings of reading. She also brought, on a separate piece of paper folded in her coat pocket, a list of the other documents she suspected existed, the ones affecting the Reinholdts and the 2 other families Helen had identified, and the specific statutory language she'd found in the 1861 Territorial Land Act that she believed made Price's filing method defective at the root. The Territorial Registry Office in Billings was staffed by a man named Whitfield, who had the manner of someone who had seen a great many people come through his door, convinced they'd been wronged, and had developed a cautious professional neutrality toward all of them. He listened to Clara's presentation of the Dutton situation for 20 minutes without expression. He asked 3 questions. He looked at the documents she'd flagged. Then he said, "Can you leave these with me for review?" "Copies," she said. She'd made copies in the evenings before leaving. "The originals stay with the family." He looked at her over his reading glasses. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't entirely a compliment, but it wasn't not one. "I worked in a law office," she said, "a long time ago." They were in Billings for 2 days. On the second day, Whitfield called them back and told them, in the careful language of a man who was making no promises, that the chain of title on the Dutton parcel appeared to contain irregularities that warranted further examination by the Territorial Review Office, and that he was initiating a formal inquiry, and that pending that inquiry, the disputed claim would be suspended. Garrett Dutton sat in the chair across from Whitfield's desk for a moment after that, and didn't say anything. Then he said, "So we haven't lost it." "Not pending the inquiry," Whitfield said. On the wagon back to Hargrove County, Garrett was quiet for the first hour. Then he said, "How did you know where to look in the documents?" "The language they use has a pattern," Clara said. "Once you see it once, you see it everywhere." "Price has been doing this for years," he said. "I think so," she said. "And Vance." The word came out with an edge. "Vance needs land and Price needs money, and they've built something between them that's worked as long as nobody looked at it closely," Clara said. "They were counting on nobody looking closely." Garrett looked at the road ahead. "People looked at it," he said. "They just didn't know what they were seeing." "That's different from not looking," she said. "Yes." The ranch looked the same when she came back, which was either obvious or comforting depending on how tired you were, and she was tired enough that it was both. Eli came running from the yard when the wagon came up the road and reported to her at length about several things that had happened in her absence, none of which constituted emergencies, but all of which he felt she should know. And she listened to all of it seriously because Eli was a person who needed his information to be received seriously. Caleb was at the fence on the north parcel when she arrived, the same fence he'd been repairing since March, and she'd understood by now that the fence was probably also about being somewhere specific to think. She walked out there after she'd been in the house long enough to wash her hands and drink half a cup of coffee. He heard her coming and turned around. "Well?" he said. "They've initiated a formal inquiry," she said. "The claim is suspended pending review." He nodded slowly. There are going to be more, she said. Other families. Helen is talking to 2 more already. Are you going to help them? Yes, she said. It didn't require consideration. He turned back to the fence and adjusted the wire he'd been working on. She stood beside him and looked at the north parcel. 600 acres of Montana at its plainest and best, grass coming up green from the late spring, the hills in the distance doing whatever hills do in the afternoon light. Whitfield at the registry said something when we were leaving, she said. What? He said if the inquiry finds what it looks like it's going to find, Price's filings going back several years are going to be reviewed. All of them. Caleb's hand stilled on the fence wire. All of them, she said again. Not just the Duttons, not just us. Every filing Price has done that follows the same pattern. He turned and looked at her. That's... he started. Yes, she said. He looked back at the pasture. She could see him working through what that meant. Not just for the ranch, not just for the Duttons, but for the entire structure that Vance had built over 3 years in Hargrove County. If the filings unraveled, the land claims based on them unraveled. The conditional clauses, the defeasible titles, all of it built on a method that was now under formal territorial scrutiny. He's going to come at you harder, Caleb said. I know. When he realizes what the inquiry means, I know, she said again. He looked at her. She looked back. There was something in his face that she hadn't seen before, or that she'd seen but hadn't let herself name, and she thought about what Helen Marsh had said. You're a woman who's been here less than a year, no land, no official standing. And she thought about what she'd said in response, which was that she knew, and she thought about all the things she'd known and done anyway, since October, since the storm, since she'd walked down a Montana road with a bleeding heel and $4.60, and she thought that she was done, specifically and permanently done, with measuring what she offered against how much she expected to receive. Caleb, she said. Yeah, he said. He was still looking at her with that thing on his face that was taking up more space than he was used to allowing. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I want you to know that. Whatever he does next, whatever the inquiry turns up, however hard it gets, I'm not going anywhere. He was quiet for a moment. That's a large thing to say, he said. I know what it is, she said. He turned to face her fully, away from the fence, and the afternoon was quiet except for the wind in the grass of the north parcel, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the very first night, directly, trying to understand what she needed, except that this time what she needed was not shelter from a storm, and they both knew it. I'd like to ask you something, he said. His voice was careful, but underneath the carefulness was something that wasn't careful at all. All right, she said. I'd like to ask you to stay, he said. Not for the books, not for the children, though God knows they need you. He stopped, started again. I'd like to ask you to stay because the last 6 months have been the first 6 months in 3 years that this ranch has felt like the place I built it to be. And the difference is you, and I'm not good at saying things like this, so I'm just saying it plain. She looked at him. She thought about the 8 months of letters and the hope she'd carried across half the country packed like something fragile. And she thought about Elias Vance's porch and the word embarrassment and the particular cruelty of being reduced to a single visible fact. And she thought about a lantern moving through trees in a rainstorm, and a man who had looked at her face specifically, trying to understand what she needed, and she thought it was a strange and specific thing, the path a life could take when you stop trying to control its direction and simply refuse to stop walking. You didn't have to say it plain, she said, but I'm glad you did. He looked at her for a moment more. Then he turned back to the fence. I've got about an hour of light left on this section, he said. I'll start dinner, she said. She walked back toward the house. Behind her, she could hear the fence wire settling into place, the particular sound of something being made to hold. She went inside. Maddie was at the stove. She looked up when Clara came in, and something in her face, that watchful, measuring face that Clara had spent 6 months learning the language of, was different, quieter. Not soft, still not soft, but settled in a way it hadn't been before. Duttons get sorted, Maddie said. Getting sorted? Clara said. It'll take time. Maddie nodded. She handed Clara the spare spoon without being asked, the way you hand something to a person who is going to be where you are for a while, and turned back to the stove, and Clara stood beside her and they cooked dinner together in the warm kitchen while outside the afternoon finished its business, and the children found their way back from wherever they'd been, and the north parcel lay green and holding under the Montana sky. The territorial inquiry took 11 weeks. Clara knew this because she counted them, not obsessively, not with the kind of anxious daily marking that fear produces, but with the practical awareness of someone who understood that 11 weeks was also 11 weeks of Elias Vance knowing the inquiry existed and having time to respond to it. She did not make the mistake of thinking that because the machinery of the territorial office was now moving in the right direction, Vance would simply wait for it to finish. He didn't. The first thing he did was quiet. She only learned about it secondhand through Helen Marsh, who heard it from Ainsley, who heard it from a man who did business with Vance's operation. Vance had begun making approaches to the two families Helen had identified as the next most likely to come forward about Price's filings. Not threatening approaches. He was too careful for that, but financial ones. Offers to purchase disputed parcels at prices that were below fair value but above nothing, which was what those families feared they might end up with if the situation dragged on. It was a reasonable fear, and he knew it was a reasonable fear, and he was using it the way he used everything, carefully, with the appearance of doing someone a favor. Clara heard this and sat with it for a day. Then she rode out to the first family, the Reinholds, herself. Mrs. Reinhold was a woman in her mid-60s who had been running the property alone since her husband died 2 years prior, with the help of her adult nephew, who came when he could and left when his own family needed him, which was often. She was not a woman who wasted words or sentiment, and she received Clara at her kitchen table with the wariness of someone who had already been visited by one persuasive person this week and was not certain what category to put the second one in. Clara didn't try to persuade her of anything. She put the documents on the table, her notes on the Reinhold filing, the statutory language, the parallel she'd drawn between the Reinhold situation and the Dutton situation. And she walked through it, and she told Mrs. Reinhold exactly what she had, and exactly what she didn't have, and exactly what the territorial inquiry might produce and might not produce, and how long it might take, and what Vance's offer represented in terms of the land's actual value. When she was done, Mrs. Reinhold said, "You're not telling me what to do." "No," Clara said. "Most people who come out here tell me what to do." "I imagine they do," Clara said. "But it's your land and your decision, and I'm not in a position to make it for you." Mrs. Reinhold looked at the documents for a moment. "What would you do?" she said. The same question Garrett Dutton had asked her in Billings. "I'd wait for the inquiry," Clara said. "But I'd also document everything Vance has said to you and when he said it and who was present. Not for right now, just so you have it." Mrs. Reinhold looked at her with the particular assessment of an older woman who has spent a lifetime calibrating the trustworthiness of people who are trying to help her. "You're the woman from Hawthorne's ranch," she said. "Yes," Clara said. "The one from Ohio?" "Yes." "Vance sent a letter about you to the paper." "He did?" Mrs. Reinhold nodded slowly. "My husband read that paper every week for 30 years, she said. "He always said the anonymous letters were the most interesting ones because they told you more about who wrote them than about whoever they were written about." She folded her hands on the table. "I'll wait for the inquiry." The second family, the Pierces, who ran a small sheep operation east of the Dutton property, were harder. Thomas Pierce was a man who had been frightened for long enough that the fear had calcified into a kind of permanent bracing, and he had a wife and 4 children, and the prospect of losing land was not abstract for him. Clara sat with both of them for 2 hours, and she did not minimize what they were facing, and she did not promise outcomes she couldn't guarantee. What she told them was that they were not alone in this, and that the isolation, each family believing their situation was individual, each family too embarrassed or afraid to compare notes, was itself part of how the method worked. She told them the inquiry had already changed the ground. Thomas Pierce said, "If the inquiry doesn't go the way you think it will, then you'll be in the same position you're in now," Clara said. "Vance's offer doesn't expire in the next 11 weeks. You can still take it then if you need to." She looked at him. "But you can't untake it once you've taken it." He was quiet. You have time, she said. Use it. They waited. The weeks had their own texture. The ranch work continued, because it always continued. There was no season on the Montana frontier that allowed for pausing, and the summer brought its own demands, the cattle and the hay and the fence lines that were always in some state of needing attention. Caleb and Clara had not spoken again about what had passed between them at the fence on the north parcel, but something had shifted in the daily architecture of how they were with each other. Less careful, more direct, the way people are when they've said something true and don't need to keep circling it. He started asking her opinion on things he hadn't asked before. Not the books, which she'd been handling for months, but the land decisions, the cattle market, whether to expand the north pasture or hold the capital. She gave her opinions honestly, including when they differed from his, and he listened without needing her to be wrong in order to feel right, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience of men. Thomas had turned 14 in June and was spending more time with Caleb on the range, learning the cattle work in the serious way of a boy who has decided this is what he is going to do with himself. He and Clara had reached a kind of equilibrium over the months. Not warm, exactly, but honest. He asked her once, working through an arithmetic problem she'd set him, why she knew so much about legal documents. My uncle's law office, she said. 2 years of copying other people's arguments. Did you want to be a lawyer? He said. She considered this. The law office didn't take women as lawyers, she said. My uncle let me copy documents because I was useful and didn't require pay beyond room and board. She looked at him. It didn't occur to me at the time to be angry about it. It probably should have. Thomas looked at the arithmetic problem. That doesn't seem fair, he said. No, she said. It wasn't. But you learn things anyway. You always learn things, she said. Whether the situation is fair or not, the learning is yours regardless. He thought about this with the seriousness he brought to things he was filing away for later. She'd come to understand that about Thomas. He didn't respond to everything immediately. He stored things and came back to them. Maddie, by midsummer, had stopped being the household's primary manager in the way she'd been before Clara arrived, and had started instead to be what she actually was, which was a 15-year-old girl with a very good mind and a lot of opinions and the beginnings of interest that extended beyond the kitchen. She had her mother's recipe books, and she'd told Clara once, matter-of-factly, that she'd been adding to them since she was 12. Clara asked to see them. They were meticulous. Not just recipes, but notes on what worked and what didn't, and why, the kind of observational record-keeping that required patience and a real interest in the material. Have you ever thought about doing something with this beyond the house? Clara asked. Maddie looked at her with the expression she used when she thought a question might be condescending. Like what? She said flatly. I don't know, Clara said honestly. You're 15. You don't have to know yet. I'm just asking if you've thought about it. Maddie was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Ainsley at the dry goods, she's been asking if I'd sell preserves through the store. Said people have been asking after them since last winter. She said it carefully, like something she hadn't said out loud before. Would you want to? It would bring in money, Maddie said. Which was not quite an answer to the question Clara had asked, and they both knew it. Maddie, Clara said, would you want to? Maddie looked at her hands. Yes, she said, I would. Then let's figure out what that looks like, Clara said. It was a small thing. In the scale of everything that was happening that summer, it was a very small thing. But Clara had spent enough of her life watching competence get absorbed into circumstance, used, relied upon, never named, that she'd learned to pay attention when she saw it happening to someone else. The territorial inquiry concluded on a Thursday in late August. Whitfield sent a formal letter to the Hawthorne Ranch, which was the address of record for the initial inquiry, and Clara read it at the kitchen table with Caleb standing beside her, and the letter itself taking up only one page because government findings, when they find what they're looking for, don't require elaborate language. The Territorial Review Office had found the price filing method to contain systematic procedural defects inconsistent with the Territorial Land Act of 1861 and its 1869 amendment. Specifically, the use of conditional claim language in what were represented as routine administrative documents, combined with the practice of sending such documents to property owners without the standard advisory notice required under territorial statute. The review was being expanded to cover all filings processed under Price's office in the past 4 years. Price had been suspended from his position pending the expanded review. Any land claims derived from the defective filings were suspended until each case could be individually reviewed. Clara read it twice. She set it on the table. 4 years of filings, Caleb said. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Is it over? The inquiry part is over, she said. The review of individual cases will take time. The Duttons and the Reinholdts and the Pierces will each still need to go through their own process. She looked up at him. But the foundation Vance built this on, the method, the mechanism, that's done. Caleb looked at the letter. Something moved across his face that she'd only seen once before, at the fence on the north parcel, when she'd told him the Billings filing had gone through. The look of a man who has been holding a weight and has just been told he can set it down. What about Vance himself, he said. That depends on what the expanded review finds, she said. If the examiners can establish that he directed the filing method, that it was coordinated between him and Price deliberately, it goes beyond civil land disputes. She paused. But that's not something I can do. That's for the territorial authorities. He nodded. She folded the letter and looked out the window at the yard, where Eli was doing something in the dust that appeared to involve a significant number of small rocks arranged in a pattern that meant something to him specifically. I need to tell Helen, she said, and the Duttons. They should hear it before it becomes general knowledge. I'll ride with you, Caleb said. She looked at him. Unless you'd rather go alone, he said. No, she said. Come. They told Helen first, then the Duttons, then stopped at the Pierce property on the way back because it was on the road, and Thomas Pierce had spent 3 months bracing against an outcome he'd been afraid to hope would be different. When Clara told him what the letter said, he sat down in the chair on his porch and put his hands over his face for a moment, not crying exactly, but doing the thing adjacent to it that men do when they've been frightened for a very long time and the fear has just lifted. His wife, standing in the doorway, met Clara's eyes over his head. Clara nodded once. Mrs. Pierce let out a breath that she'd probably been holding since May. Word traveled through Hargrove County the way it always did, faster than any intentional communication and with a speed that suggested people had been watching for it. By the following Saturday, when Clara was in the settlement at the dry goods store, a routine she'd maintained through all of it, deliberately, because she was not going to change her ordinary behavior based on Elias Vance's ability to make her feel unwelcome in the place she lived, 3 separate people spoke to her directly, not with grand declarations. 2 of them were simply the ordinary exchanges of neighbors, the acknowledgement of presence that in a small community is itself a statement. The third was Ainsley, who stopped beside her at the counter and said, "Word is Price is out." "Suspended," she said, "pending review." "Same thing," Ainsley said. He looked at her steadily. "You did good work." He said it the same way he said everything, without ornament, as a plain assessment. She had learned to value that quality of plainness. "There were a lot of people involved," she said. "There were," he said. "You started it." He moved on. She finished her purchase and went outside, and the settlement in late August was going about its ordinary business. Wagons in the street, the sound of the smithy, someone's dog conducting an investigation near the corner of the hardware building. And she stood for a moment in the ordinary noise of it and thought about October, about the crossroads in the rain, about a trunk set at the top of porch steps facing outward. She thought, I live here now. Not with surprise. With the particular weight of a fact that has been true for a while and is only now being stated clearly. Elias Vance came to the ranch in September. She had not expected him to come himself. She'd expected lawyers, or silence, or some further document. She had not expected him to come up the road in his good coat on a Tuesday afternoon while Caleb was in the far pasture and she was alone in the house with James and Nora doing their letters at the kitchen table. She heard the horse in the yard and looked out the window and recognized him and felt, for a single moment, the old thing, the contraction, the instinct towards smallness. She noticed it. She let it pass through without following it anywhere. She told James and Nora to keep working, and she went outside. He looked different than he had in May, in the dry goods store. Not smaller exactly, but less certain of his dimensions. The suspension of Price and the inquiry had cost him something she could see on him but couldn't quite name. The particular deflation of a man who has been operating from a position of invisible power and has just had the invisibility removed. "Mr. Vance," she said. "Miss Whitmore," he said. He'd never used her name before. The usage felt deliberate, like an opening position. "It's Mrs. Hawthorne," she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. She and Caleb had married quietly in July, at the settlement office, with Helen Marsh and Robert Ainsley as witnesses, and Maddie and Thomas and all 5 of the younger children present, and Eli had fallen asleep standing up during the paperwork portion and had to be caught by Thomas, which had made the whole thing feel more like them than a formal ceremony would have. "I wasn't aware," Vance said. "There's a lot you weren't aware of," she said. "What can I do for you?" He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man composing himself. "I've had counsel advising me on the territorial findings," he said. "I wanted to speak to Hawthorne directly." "Caleb is in the pasture," she said. "You're welcome to wait or come back. But if you have something to say to this household, I'm the person who runs it, so you can say it to me." He looked at her. She had thought sometimes about what this moment would feel like. Facing him again, not on his porch with her trunk pointed outward, not in the dry goods store with other people watching, but squarely, in a position she'd built herself. She'd thought it might feel like triumph, and she'd been a little suspicious of that feeling because she'd learned to be suspicious of what feels like winning when the other person hasn't finished playing. But it didn't feel like triumph, it felt like standing on solid ground. That was all. The ordinary security of knowing where your feet are. "The territorial review is going to take time," he said. "There are parties involved who might benefit from reaching private resolutions before the formal process concludes." "Meaning what?" she said. "Meaning some of the land in dispute could be returned to prior holders voluntarily, without waiting for the review findings. In exchange for what?" she said. He looked at her. "In exchange for not pressing the question of how the filing method was originated." She looked at him for a long moment. "You want the families whose land was taken to accept its return as a private settlement," she said, "in exchange for agreeing not to pursue the question of who directed Price to develop that filing method in the first place." He said nothing. "You're afraid the expanded review is going to find the coordination between you and Price," she said, "and you want to offer enough to make the people who were harmed willing to stop before it gets there." His jaw was tight. "I'm offering a resolution that serves everyone." "It serves you," she said. "The families whose land was taken are already going to get their land back through the review. What you're offering is a faster version of what they're already going to receive, in exchange for protecting you from what comes next." He was quiet. "I won't carry that offer to any of the families," she said. "If you want to speak to Caleb about our specific situation, he'll be back by evening. But this conversation, as it stands, is over." He looked at her. She could see him calculating what he had left to work with, which directions remained open. She'd seen that calculation on his face in the dry goods store, and she'd seen it in the 1873 document he'd had Price carry to the ranch as a routine formality, and she recognized it now as the face of a man who has built everything on angles and is running out of them. "You're a stubborn woman," he said. "It was supposed to be cutting. It landed flat." "I've been told," she said. He turned his horse and went back up the road, and she watched him go. And when he was out of sight, she went back inside, where James had finished his letters, and Nora was working on her numbers, and the kitchen smelled like the soup she'd left on the stove, and she sat down at the table and said, "How are the 6s coming, Nora?" "They're hard," Nora said. "They are," Clara said. "Show me where you're getting stuck." When she told Caleb that evening what Vance had said, he listened all the way through without moving, and then sat back in his chair with the careful stillness of a man deciding not to go somewhere his anger was pulling him. "He came here," Caleb said. "Yes." "While I was in the pasture." "Yes." "And he thought you'd carry his offer to the other families." "He thought it was worth trying," she said. "He's running out of options." Caleb looked at the table. What happens to him when the review finds the coordination? I don't know exactly, she said. Civil liability for the land claims, certainly. Potentially more, depending on how the territorial prosecutor reads it. She paused. He's a man who's built his life on being untouchable in this county. Whatever happens, that's done. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I don't feel as satisfied about that as I thought I would, he said. No, she said. It's not very satisfying. She looked at him. It's just necessary. He nodded slowly. That was one of the things she'd come to understand about him. He didn't need the satisfaction of revenge. He just needed the threat to be removed, and those were different orientations, and not everyone had the second one without the first. He called me stubborn, she said. Caleb looked up. What did you say? I said I'd been told. Something moved across his face. Who told you? Various people, she said, over the years. Well, he said, they weren't wrong. She looked at him. They also weren't saying it the way I mean it, he said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The Territorial Review concluded its individual case assessments in November, the same month the first serious snow came and the north parcel disappeared under white, the same way it had the previous winter, and Clara watched it from the kitchen window and felt the year turning under her like the wheel it was. The Duttons got their 40 acres back, formally and without condition. The Reinholdts' filing was voided. The Pierces' disputed parcel was restored. 3 other families whose situations had emerged during the expanded review received similar findings. The coordination between Vance and Price was documented in the review findings, not as criminal prosecution, which would require a separate process, but as a matter of formal territorial record, which meant it was real and legible and public in a way that Vance's careful, invisible machinery had never been intended to be. Price left the county in October quietly. Clara heard about it from Ainsley, who had heard from the man who'd replaced him on an interim basis. She didn't feel much about Price's leaving. He was a small actor in his own story, the kind of person who does damage not from cruelty but from complacence, willing to do whatever paid, not asking what it cost anyone else. Vance stayed. She had expected him to leave too, and he didn't, and she thought about that sometimes. The staying, the way he moved through the settlement now with the diminished presence of a man who had lost the thing that had made him feel large. He didn't approach her again. He didn't approach Caleb. He ran his ranch, which was still substantial, still profitable, still one of the larger operations in the county, and she supposed that for some people the loss of power was worse than the loss of material things, and for some people it was the opposite, and she didn't know which Vance was, and found over time that she cared less and less about finding out. What she cared about was the Hawthorne Ranch in the winter of 1876, which was different from the Hawthorne Ranch in the winter of 1875, not dramatically, not in ways that would be obvious to a stranger, but in ways that were obvious to anyone who had been inside both. The books were clean and accurately kept and showed a modest surplus for the first time in 3 years, partly because the cattle operation had been good, and partly because the account management had caught 3 recurring inefficiencies that had been invisible when the records were less orderly. Caleb had used part of the surplus to repair the barn roof, which had been a problem since Margaret's time, and which he'd been solving temporarily and repeatedly rather than permanently. The repair was permanent now. Maddie's preserves were on the shelf at Ainsley's dry goods store, on consignment, and had sold out twice. Maddie had reinvested the money in better jars, which was both practically sensible and also a decision made by a girl who was beginning to think about something that extended beyond the immediate season. And Clara noticed this without commenting on it because Maddie had not asked for comment, and because some things needed room to grow without being narrated. Thomas rode with Caleb most days now, fully, as a working member of the operation rather than a child being supervised in adult work. He was tall and getting taller, and he had his mother's eyes, which Clara knew because she'd seen a small portrait of Margaret that Caleb kept in the front room, and sometimes she looked at Thomas and thought about the woman she'd never met, and felt something that wasn't quite grief, but wasn't separate from it either. The acknowledgement of a presence that had shaped everything she'd walked into all those months ago in the rain. Bess was 11 and had decided that she wanted to know about everything, which was an excellent quality that made her exhausting company and she had taken to following Clara around during the daily work with a continuous stream of questions that ranged from the practical to the philosophical, without any apparent transition between them. Clara answered all of them as honestly as she could, including the ones she didn't have answers to, which she said so rather than inventing answers, because she had noticed that children could tell when you were inventing, and they respected you less for it, even when they couldn't articulate why. James was 7 and had turned into a reader, which had surprised everyone, including James. He read slowly and with effort, and the effort was clearly both difficult and deeply satisfying in the way that effortful things sometimes are. And he read everything he could get his hands on, including the backs of seed catalogs and the fine print on supply invoices, and once the first 3 pages of the Legal Land Act text that Clara had left on the table, which she had not noticed until she found him there and asked what he was reading, and he told her, and she'd had to work to keep her face neutral. Nora's bees were perfect, had been since November of the previous year. Eli, who was 6 now and had recently become interested in what he called the business of things, meaning the underlying mechanism of how any given thing worked, had spent a week asking questions about the territorial inquiry that were, from a 6-year-old, surprisingly precise. He wanted to know who decided the rules and why the rules worked that way, and what happened if someone broke them and who made the person who broke them stop. Clara had answered all of these questions to the best of her ability, and at the end of the week Eli had said, with the certainty of a child who has reached a conclusion, "You should be the one who makes the rules." She had laughed, a real one, the kind that comes before you can think about whether to. "I don't think that's how it works," she said. "It should be," Eli said, and went back to the rocks he was arranging, and Clara had sat with that for a moment in the way you sit with something said without guile that lands more squarely than most things said on purpose. On a Saturday afternoon in late November, Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with the account books. The quarterly summary, the one she did every 3 months to give Caleb a clear picture of where they stood. When Caleb came in from the cold and poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her without speaking, which was ordinary, and then sat there without speaking for longer than usual, which wasn't. She looked up. He had the look he got when he'd been thinking about something for a while. Not troubled, but occupied, working something out. "What?" she said. "I've been thinking about the Duttons' east parcel," he said. She waited. "Garrett mentioned last week that he's having trouble with the spring water on that side. The eastern edge runs dry by August, and they've been hauling water in the summer, which is expensive and unsustainable," she said. "Yes. I've been looking at our water rights on the north parcel. The creek that runs through the northwest corners, it doesn't dry up. It's fed from higher up." He turned his cup in his hands. "If I ran a shared easement to the Duttons' east edge, they could run pipe from our creek in the summer months." She looked at him. "And what would you want in return?" "Shared fence maintenance on the property line," he said. "Their side's been needing attention since before all this started. It would be easier as a shared project." She looked at the account books in front of her. She thought about the summer, about the Duttons at the kitchen table with their oilcloth stack of documents, about Garrett's face in the Billings registry office when Whitfield said suspended pending review. She thought about neighbors and what the word meant out here, where the distances between properties were long and the winters were longer. "It's a good idea," she said. "I thought you might think so," he said. He stood up and went to the window, looking out at the yard. The snow had settled everything into gray and white, and the particular silence that comes after a heavy fall. "Clara," he said. "Yes." He didn't turn around. "You know what you've done here." She looked at him. "I don't mean the land cases," he said. "I mean—" He stopped. He was not a man who found this kind of thing easy, and she had no interest in making it harder by filling the space before he was done. "I mean the whole of it. This house. These children." A pause. "Me." She set down her pen. "I know what I have here," she said. "That's not the same thing." He turned around. "No," he said. "It isn't." He looked at her with the directness she'd come to rely on. No decoration, no performance, just the thing itself. "I want you to know that I know it. What it took. What you gave this place when you had no reason to give it anything." She thought about saying something modest. She considered it and set it aside. I had every reason, she said. That's what I want you to understand. It wasn't charity, and it wasn't making the best of a bad situation. I gave what I gave because this was worth giving it to. He looked at her for a long moment. Yeah, he said, quietly. The way he said things, he meant all the way down. He sat back down and she picked up her pen, and they were quiet together in the kitchen while the snow fell outside and the fire kept the cold where it belonged. And somewhere in the house, one of the children was doing something that required running, which was James's particular mode of movement, and from the upper floor came the sound of Maddie's voice telling him to stop. This was the truth of it, not the inquiry, not the land cases, not even the way the county had shifted around her in the months since the register letter. The truth was this kitchen, this table, this man across from her with his coffee and his slow, careful thoughts. The truth was Eli's rocks, and Nora's perfect bees, and the smell of Maddie's preserves, and Thomas on horseback beside his father in the far pasture. Clara had spent 31 years being told, in one way or another, what she was not. Not suited, not fitting, not the right kind of woman for the right kind of life. She had believed it for a long time, not in the conscious agreeing way, but in the way that you believe things you hear repeated until you stop noticing they're not yours, until the repetition becomes a kind of furniture, invisible, because it's always been there. What she had learned, not in a single moment, but in 11 months of moments accumulated one against the next, was that the size of a person has nothing to do with the size of what they carry, and that belonging is not a thing you are granted by the right circumstances or the right man or the right place. It is a thing you build, with your hands and your mind, and the stubborn refusal to stop building even when someone on a porch in October tells you to take your trunk and go home. She hadn't gone home. She had found it. That was the difference between her and a woman who took what was offered, and it was not a comfortable difference because finding it had required her to be lost first, frightened first, standing in a rainstorm with no road under her feet and $4.60 and a heel that wouldn't stop bleeding. It had required her to make the mistake of letting herself hope and then survive what happened when the hope was dismantled, and to find that she was still standing after, and to keep walking regardless. There is a particular kind of person who is capable of this. Not a special person. That's the part that gets misunderstood. Not someone exceptional or rare or built differently than the rest. Just someone who, when the ground disappears, refuses to assume there is no ground, who keeps moving until their feet find it again. Clara was that kind of person. She had not always known it. She knew it now. She finished the quarterly accounts as the light outside went from afternoon to early dark, and she called the children to the table, and there was the noise and negotiation of 7 children sitting down to dinner, which was never orderly and probably never would be. And Eli knocked over his milk and caught the cup before more than a third of it went on the table, which he announced as a triumph, and Clara handed him a cloth to clean it up with and told him it was indeed a triumph. And Caleb looked at her from across the table over the heads of the children, and she looked back at him, and there was something in that look that required no language. Outside, the Montana night was cold and clear, and the stars over the Bitterroot foothills were the kind of stars you can only see where there is nothing between you and them. And the north parcel lay under its blanket of snow, and the creek that ran through the northwest corner had not dried up and would not dry up. And in the spring there would be work to do, fence line to share with the Duttons, and water to run east, and accounts to keep, and children to teach, and cattle to manage, and all of it waiting with the patience of things that are genuinely worth doing. Clara Hawthorne washed the dinner dishes with Bess drying beside her, and Maddie putting away, and the younger children doing whatever they were doing in the next room, and the house smelled like winter and wood smoke, and the particular density of a life fully inhabited, and she thought, here, right here. This is what I walked toward in the rain when I didn't know where I was walking. And she kept washing the dishes, steady and sure, the way you do a thing when you know exactly where you are and you are not going anywhere.